On the 4th of July 1946, in front of a huge crowd of thousands, a number of men and women made their way to a huge gallows on a hill in Gdansk, and they were greeted by their executioners. The men and women who were awaiting their date with the executioners were the former guards of Stutthof concentration camp, a camp which was infamous for its treatment of prisoners during the Second World War. It was a huge site, which was known for its deadly operations, in which around 65,000 people perished within the barbed wire fences. But one man who would be brought to trial and was executed separately from many of the guards who worked inside of his camp was the Commandant of Stutthof, Max Pauly. He was a man who had acted as the Commandant of Stutthof during its early years in operation, but he was known for being a brutal and ruthless man. Join us today as we look at the execution of the Commandant of Stutthof concentration camp, and as always, to support our channel, please make sure to subscribe. Max Pauly was born on the 1st of June 1907 inside of Wesselburum, and he was the son of a man who owned a hardware store. He came from humble beginnings, but within the Nazi Party, he would become a monster like so many would. Pauly graduated from elementary school and then worked inside of his father's store, and he would work as a salesman. But his father died in 1928 when he was 21, and Max Pauly then took control of the hardware store. He would then 2 years later marry his wife, who was also from his hometown, and she was the daughter of a cattle dealer, and the pair would have 5 children together. His wife incidentally would die in August 1944 as the Second World War raged on. But at the end of 1928, Max Pauly then joined the Nazi Party, and he then became a member of the SA, Hitler's brown shirts and violent thugs, who would disrupt political meetings of their enemies, and he would be part of this. The SA would become very powerful, and they would fly too close to the sun, as Hitler would later purge them. But Pauly was considered a member of the Old Guard, or an outer Kampfer, as he was a very early supporter. But he then, in May 1930, transitioned to become a member of Himmler's SS, the paramilitary group of the Nazi Party, who would later be involved in mass execution and slaughter, and also in running the concentration camps. Inside of the SS, Max Pauly continued to rise throughout the ranks, and before Hitler's seizure of power, he was appointed as an SS Sturm leader in January 1932. He then became the head of a local group, but at the time there were a number of attacks carried out by the SS and Pauly's groups. In 1932, the Nazis were not yet in power, but Pauly was arrested many times and accused of breaching the peace, and he would then go on to serve a 7-month prison sentence. He had been allegedly involved in the destruction of a campaign car used by another political party, but following his release from prison, he was then made an SS Hauptsturmführer and then an SS Sturmbannführer. By the turn of 1936, Pauly had also become a full-time leader and a paid-up member of the SS, and he had become a graduate from the Nazi Police Academy, and he would then attend a course which brought him into a concentration camp. Dachau was the first and earliest concentration camp opened, and Pauly would learn here what it took to become a concentration camp guard. He continued to lead detachments of SS men, and he would then take command of the 71st SS Standard in Danzig Post, and the command of this group he held until the end of the Second World War. But further promotion came, and following attending and completing another course at the SS Leadership School in Dachau, Max Pauly was then appointed to a new SS battalion, where he worked as a chief of staff. This group was a special unit which operated inside the free city of Gdansk, and Pauly would then take control of the internment camps in the Polish corridor. But as the Second World War broke out, he would be involved and also deemed responsible for the murder of 1,400 mentally ill people. But then in the Gdansk region, he would be given command of the Stutthof concentration camp. He transitioned to the SS Deathheads unit, but he would then oversee Stutthof's creation and opening, but it would become a very brutal camp. Stutthof concentration camp was created following the invasion of Poland, and it was a place where many Polish people would be housed inside of following the beginning of the invasion. It became a concentration camp in 1942, and the original site was surrounded by barbed wire, and it had 8 barracks filled with inmates. But then the camp was enlarged heavily, and a new site containing 30 new barrack buildings, and also a crematoria and a gas chamber was added in 1943. This was to make sure that the executions of prisoners could take place as efficiently and as quickly as possible. 150 people at a time could be held inside of the gas chamber there. The camp staff was made up of many men, but also a number of women who worked there. Women such as Erna Beilhardt, Hertha Bofa and Jenny Wanda Bachmann would become notorious for their treatment of inmates at Stutthof, but as time went on, there were huge transports of women and men who were sent from camps such as Auschwitz. The conditions of Stutthof were very harsh, and dozens of thousands of people succumbed to starvation and disease epidemics that were sweeping through the site. Executions were also carried out at Stutthof, and many dozens of prisoners were shot at the site, with thousands being slaughtered also inside the aforementioned gas chamber. But Stutthof's inmates also suffered at the hands of medical staff who would inject sick patients with phenol, killing them, and the guards would also violently beat prisoners to death. The forced labour that the inmates were forced to conduct was also horrific, and the prisoners were given insufficient rations for the roles they were doing. But after working at Stutthof for a number of years, Max Pauly would then be transferred to the Neuengamme concentration camp. Neuengamme was a site where there was also a lot of bloodshed too, as almost 43,000 of the 106,000 people held there were killed. The site was based around the idea of extermination through labour, as prisoners were not given sufficient food and they were forced to work in horrific conditions. The medical treatment at the camp was also poor, and many of the people who worked there were forced to create armaments for the German industry. Max Pauly whilst here would control the camp until the end of the Second World War, and during his time he was involved in the slaughter of many children, including those who were sent for medical experiments. He was also involved in the executions of 58 men and 13 women from other concentration camps. He would continue to be promoted, but as the end of the Second World War came around, Max Pauly would be captured. Despite living on site at Neuengamme with his family, Pauly would try to flee the camp and any form of justice. At the end of April 1945, Max Pauly headed to Flensburg, which was considered the last bastion of Nazi power following Hitler's death. But he would return to his hometown, but he was caught living with his children at his sister-in-law's. But then it came to bring Max Pauly to trial for his crimes, and he was a man who was associated with the cruelty inside of Neuengamme, but little was said about his time at Stutthof. He was taken to Hamburg, where he was tried in front of a British military court, and whilst at trial, it was stated that Pauly was a man who was a brute, and was one of the worst commandants who had overseen much bloodshed and execution. Max Pauly was found guilty of war crimes, and he was then sentenced to death for this. He was an experienced man who had worked at different concentration camps. He would never, interestingly, be tried for his crimes at Stutthof, but only for what he did at Neuengamme. He was sent to Hamelin Prison to await his death sentence, which would come 5 days later. On the 8th of October 1946, Pauly was led out of his cell into the execution chamber of the prison, and he had met the executioner Pierrepoint days before, who had calculated his height and weight, ready for the drop through the trapdoor. Max Pauly was led into the execution chamber and up the scaffold, and Pierrepoint had previously secured his arms and legs. A black hood and then a noose was placed over his head, as Pauly was then shuffled over the trapdoor, and this was released. Max Pauly, the Commandant of Stutthof, was instantly executed, and he was then buried inside of Hamelin Prison's walls, but then he would be exhumed years later, and his body would be moved to a nearby cemetery. He was a man who was notorious for his brutal actions, as a commandant of not just one, but 2 concentration camps, and he became known as a notorious Nazi. But as mentioned, he would not be tried for his actions as a commandant of Stutthof, but what he did as a commandant of Neuengamme would be enough to send him to the gallows and the hangman's noose. Thanks for watching. To support our channel, please make sure to subscribe. Once again, thank you so much for watching.